we now turn our attention to something that has been front and center in the world stage and in each of our lives for the past 19 months, the COVID-19 pandemic. The panel discussion entitled The Impact of COVID-19 on Security and Diplomacy will explore how the pandemic has shaped the international security landscape and the diplomatic efforts of countries. The conversation will be moderated by the incomparable and always fashion-forward Bobby Ghosh, editor at Bloomberg. Bobby, the floor is yours.
It's a pleasure to be back on the road and a pleasure to be here in Doha and an opportunity to have conversations with folks who are actually in the same room as you, with one exception in this case. Let me quickly introduce my panel. Forgive me for reading from a sheet because I want to make sure I get all the designations exactly right, and it is such a distinguished panel that is very important. The gentleman on the big screen is Gilles de Kerchove, who's a former counter-terrorism coordinator for the European Union. I will start from my far left here. We have Mark Power, who is Deputy Ambassador for the UK in Israel. Laila Bokhari from Norway. She's the Director of Nordic Safe Cities and former Deputy Minister and State Secretary in the Prime Minister's office in Norway and Deputy Minister at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And last and certainly not the least, we have Ambassador Nathan Sales from the US State Department. He was Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, and is currently a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. Thank you all for joining us. I'm sure this is going to be an absorbing conversation because how could it not be given the topic, which is the impact of COVID-19 on security and diplomacy. I think it's fair to say that at the start of the crisis, at least once we realized that this was going to be a global crisis, there were some expectations. One expectation, perhaps now thinking back, too optimistic, but one expectation is that this is a crisis so big that surely the world will set aside its differences and get together in a common effort to deal with this. That there would be a common diplomatic effort and that the big multilateral organizations, the United Nations, WHO, would put aside politics and really get to grips with the crisis at hand. The other expectation, fear, was that while the world was distracted by this crisis, bad actors, terrorist groups, extremist groups, would take advantage of the world's distraction to enhance their own spheres of influence, to increase their capacities to do harmful things. And I'm going to start by asking each of you to briefly sum up how you feel that those two expectations, how do you feel we've progressed or not progressed, as the case may be. Laila, would you like to start first?
Why not? Thank you so much,
Please do.
and pleasure to be here in Doha. I just arrived this morning, so I might be a bit, jet-lagged with 1 hour from Oslo, I shouldn't be saying. Pleasure to be here, and thank you to the Sofan Center. And also pleasure to sit here with colleagues in Brussels and elsewhere. Good to see you again, Gilles, to discuss such an important issue. And I think an issue which to many of us, at least in Northern Europe and maybe in the US as well, is an issue which we're talking about somehow in the near past, currently or in the near past. And I think one main message is that, to some of us, we might be recovering from the current crisis that we've been in over the last 1.5 years, but for many and to large parts of the world, we're in the midst of it.
Yes.
And will continue to be in the midst of it. So what we will be seeing is, increasing inequalities of speeding up and incorporating. And at least from a Northern European and Norwegian sense, that's always been part of the message from day one, that we need to cooperate because we're not stronger than the weakest link, if you like.
Is that a
Now,
fa-
the disappointment.
is that a failure of diplomacy? Is that just, that is how the world functions? Rich countries have certain natural advantages?
I think, I mean, it's a very natural instinct to, when you come and crisis hits you, that you look inwards. How can I protect my country and my people? Now, the history of counter-terrorism, for instance, shows that you cannot only think about your own borders. You have to cooperate. And the history of intelligence sharing has really shown us that good intelligence sharing results in better counterterrorism. Now, if you take if you move that picture, that landscape, to COVID-19, it's the same picture. You're only as strong as everyone else on board. And I think that was the main disappointment in all of this. And maybe not we should have known that, at the start of this, everyone would be looking inwards. But some of us, and I'm going to say some of us, as in also Norway, really tried to look inwards, at the same time look outwards. And I think that's a special responsibility for countries who have the resources, but also the political leadership to see and to do that, to do both things at the same time. I say yes, it was initially a crisis of diplomacy, a crisis of leadership, but a very natural state. Nobody knew what was coming up, and we saw the worst case scenarios, if you like, being made on what might happen. But initiatives very quickly came to the front. You had the COVAX initiatives, a number of other initiatives where people tried to step up. And successes have been made in that. I think the lesson today is that you cannot stop there. We need to continue to work in that fight and to continue the diplomacy on this in the long run.
Nathan, on top of the nature of this crisis itself, to the extent that the world was looking to the United States for leadership, you had the additional complication of a change of leadership in the United States, slap bang in the middle of the crisis, and not just an ordinary change of leadership, but a change from one administration which seemed determined to deny the obvious to a new administration that is trying to take a more realistic approach to it. Once that change took place, are you satisfied with the way things have progressed thereafter? Do you feel that the United States is pulling its weight in the global effort to make sure, as Leila pointed out, that everybody is safe? Because if everybody is not safe, none of us are.
Well, that's exactly right, Bobby. I think there's all sorts of reasons, humanitarian and geopolitical, why it's essential for the United States and our partners to share the vaccines that we have developed and that, by the way, actually work. Because not all candidates on the market are nearly as effective as Pfizer, yes. BioNTech, Moderna, and other Western innovations. If variants are allowed to develop in the developing world, we're going to be living this pandemic nightmare for years to come. And so it's critical that the United States continue to exercise leadership, whether through bilateral assistance or working with multilateral organizations. I think personally, from my standpoint, I'm platform agnostic. I think whether you're doing it through bilateral engagement, through multilateral platforms, through smaller coalitions of like-minded countries, each of those different mechanisms has a place. I don't think we should prioritize one over the other for the sake of some a priori commitment to a certain type of organization. What matters is results. And so I think taking a step back now to answer the bigger question, how has COVID affected geopolitics? How has COVID affected counterterrorism? I think the past 18 to 24 months haven't really affected the fight against terrorism all that much, but I think that COVID has really opened up a new front in what the United States is now calling strategic competition, particularly the competition between the United States and liberal democracy on the one hand, and authoritarian China on the other hand. So let me say just a few words about that, because I want to hear from Gilles, who's looking over our shoulders, as well as our other panelists. When it comes to counterterrorism, there was a lot of fear that Al-Qaeda, ISIS, Iran-backed groups might use the pandemic assuming that Western powers were distracted by the need to respond to the pandemic, might let their guard down, and we might see an uptick in attacks. And that didn't really happen. I think what did happen was the general trajectory of terrorist planning continued in the direction that it was going, in the same way that the policy response to terrorism continued in much the same way that it did. Now, certainly policymaker bandwidth was drained a bit, but that would have been true of any global crisis, whether it's a public health crisis, as we saw, or an environmental disaster or an economic meltdown. Yeah. Yes. So there's nothing particularly unique about COVID as a distraction from counterterrorism. Now, what was unique about COVID, and I want to pivot now to strategic competition, was COVID put into play in a very visible and salient way the reliability and trustworthiness of the Chinese Communist Party. Lots of questions were raised, and not just in the United States and not just in Europe, about the transparency and the truthfulness of Beijing, especially during the early weeks and months of the pandemic, the time when it is most critical to share information in order to put into place mitigation and prevention measures to keep a local phenomenon from becoming a truly global phenomenon. And I think the world was disappointed by shortcomings, shall we say, in transparency and visibility from the Chinese Communist Party, which put into play broader questions about the trustworthiness of China as a global leader. And I think that really galvanized in the United States opinion about what our overall framework should be for engaging with Beijing. For many years, for many decades, we had pursued a policy of engagement on the assumption that additional economic contact, person-to-person contact, and diplomatic contact would inexorably lead to the economic liberalization and political liberalization of China. That model, whatever its original merits, I think is not really the framework that the Trump administration ended on, and it's certainly not the one that the Biden administration has begun on. In fact, there's a fair amount of continuity, I think. The pandemic responses might look different, but when it comes to the strategic implications of the US relationship with China, I think there's a fair amount of continuity between late-stage Trump and opening rounds of the Biden administration.
That's for sure. And that's an interesting topic that I'm sure we'll come back to in this discussion. I want to bring Gilles in. Gilles, I hope you can hear us clearly.
Yes, I do.
Excellent. And if you wouldn't mind, from your perspective, and I don't mean your sort of the heightened perspective above our shoulders, but from the view from Brussels, how you think the counterterrorism effort over the past 2 years has gone against the backdrop of COVID-19. Are you satisfied that the counterterrorism objectives, generally speaking, remain as they were, and that the world is continued to devote adequate time, energy, resources to it? Or do you think that we've been distracted by the pandemic to our disadvantage?
Thanks, Bobby. First, let me thank warmly Ali Soufan and the Soufan Group for inviting me. And I really wish I could be sitting with my friends, Nathan and Leila and the colleague from the UK. When reflecting on this panel, I reread a note that I drafted in May 2020, trying to guess a bit what the consequence of COVID could be. And that was quite interesting to see what did materialize, what did not materialize, and what did continue. What did not materialize, in a way, we have not seen, at least in Europe, a significant increase in the number of terrorist attacks. I thought it would come because people being isolated, having some feelings of loneliness, people spending more time on internet and so more likely to be radicalized, people losing their jobs and so on. That did not happen. What we have seen in October, November last year is some new attack in Europe. You remember the beheading of Samuel Paty in France, attack in Nice in a church, attack in Vienna. but they were a lot more religiously motivated. Not much connected to Daesh or Al-Qaeda ideology, quite interestingly, more linked to the republication of the cartoon on the Prophet, or what is perceived by some as a French bashing of the Muslim world. And so that's the first one. We have not seen any attack on medical facilities. That could have been one easy target. We have not seen any weaponization of the virus. I thought it could be the case. It may, in the long term, inspire terrorist organizations to use more bio threat, but it's very difficult to weaponize. We have not seen, and that's very good news, a huge spread of the virus in the camp in northeast Syria. That could have led to huge violence and uprising. And in Europe, in fact, we have not seen any shift in terms of policy, to answer your question. First, because we've had this attack in October, November last year, which led the Commission to come with additional strategic proposal. And recently, the withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan, again, kept the terrorist file on the agenda. What did materialize, and that's not been mentioned so far, is, that was mentioned before in the previous panel, is a huge boost of extremist content on internet. And what I find quite interesting this time, that we see a lot more convergence between three types of content on the internet: the terrorist classical content that we have seen with Daesh, hate speech, and disinformation, conspiracy theory. And these three types of content reinforce each other. It has been explored a lot by right-wing violent extremism, but I think if there is one beneficiary of the COVID crisis, I think it's on the right-wing violent extremist side. The second one is quite interesting. I hope I'm wrong, but we may see in the future new forms of extremism. Remember, during the COVID confinement, we've seen 5G masts set on fire. We've seen a telecom company destroyed in Paris. And we could see more and more people in the world into which we are entering, a bit feeling alienated by a society in which all objects are connected, robots and chatbots replacing human beings, CCTV, facial recognition, artificial intelligence, policing our life, and 5G pushing internet more and more into our life. And if you see this together with other forms of movement, like eco-violence, like left-wing, and we have still some resurgence of left-wing in Europe, anarchist movement, anti-vaccination movement, we may see something developing in the future. The third aspect has been mentioned by Secretary Mallorca, of course, a boom in cybercrime. Good news, it's not cyber terrorism for the time being, but with the development of AI, I think at some stage we may be faced with some sort of cyber terrorism. So in a way, I think as Nathan said, I've seen more the continuation in terms of terrorist threat of what was happening before, somewhat amplified, especially in Africa, but it's more linked to weak governance, to corruption, to violation of human rights than I think to directly COVID. To answer your first question, in terms of failure, in terms of diplomacy and leadership, I do agree with what Leila said to a certain extent, but it was inevitable. We have been focusing and a bit more inward looking for some time, and people were not traveling anymore. So there has been a slowdown in diplomacy.
Thank you, Gilles. Mark, you're in a sort of unique position where you oversaw a shining rare example of COVID-inspired diplomacy. This effort between the government of the United Kingdom that you represent and Israel, the country where you work, in the context of COVID to try and come up with some solutions. Can you unpack that a little bit for us? And is that a template or is it sui generis and can't be repeated elsewhere?
Yeah. I mean, can I start, I think, with your first point, which is around the failure of diplomacy, because I think we can get to where you're going from there. Look, I would be a little less pessimistic than perhaps you, Leila, in the sense that I think this is a new crisis, and it comes, as Nathan's mentioned, at a point of strategic competition. And I think in that context, I don't think the multilateral system has done terribly. I think we've got, as you mentioned, COVAX and other things. We've got some notable successes and responses to the crisis out of the multilateral system. But yes, of course, it has been under strain. But if we look back on any of the security or kind of major global issues that the UN and other systems have faced, we have always struggled collectively to develop the response. And we'll talk about it a bit tomorrow, but sort of terrorism was no exception to that back when we think back to 2001. And this isn't a classic security threat. Well, it's not really a security threat necessarily at all. So the architecture is different and less developed. The WHO is not the Security Council. So you have far less to work with in terms of that. So in that context, I think that one of the things that sort of you've seen strategically emerging, or two things actually. I mean, first, I think that you see those states which have advanced biomedical tech innovation type economies have an advantage in terms of dealing with that crisis. And we heard President Kagame this morning talking about how he wants to develop vaccine manufacturing and biomedical sciences in Rwanda. And I think that just shows that sort of forward-thinking leaders are recognizing the strategic advantages gained by that. And then the second one is around how we've been able to use some of the skills and the tools that we've developed over the past to deal with security issues to try and work them into the COVID response. So one thing the UK did is develop a sort of, in the same analytical way it processes sort of security and intelligence and diplomatic reporting, now kind of looks at all of the international comparators for COVID in order to just sort of both serve as a domestic policy tool, so to help analyze what other countries are doing and inform our efforts, but also to kind of create a global information picture. So to come back to your question, what I think the UK, we did what I certainly oversaw, I mean, there are other examples of this internationally, but what certainly I was working on with Israel was two countries which have that kind of, a couple of those advantages and aspects, being able to connect in various ways over a few things, but most notably I think the vaccine campaign, where Israel had a real advantage in terms of data. It has an advanced healthcare system, but one which is able to quickly gather all the data. And so they were really the first country in the world that was able to understand what impact the vaccine was having, and then they were able to share it with us, and we were doing a lot of the, and again, not alone, but a lot of the trials around various aspects of the vaccine. So be that dosing, so how long you leave doses between the two shots in a vaccine, mixing vaccines, etc. And the two sort of perspectives combined were quite powerful in terms of being able to sort of supercharge and push out some of the research. Also, a huge dialogue on non-pharmaceutical interventions, what works in terms of lockdowns, what doesn't work, yes. Green passes, and all those things. So I think, we've kind of spurred each other on in terms of looking at different ways of managing the crisis. Quite interesting also for a diplomat, because it's totally new language, totally new subject matter to get yourself into.
Yeah. Well, I'm wondering then, can we zoom in on one of the consequences of COVID, which is that, as you flicked at it, Leila, it has shone a light on and in some ways exacerbated the inequality in the world, and it has made inequality even more front and center a discussion. There's a growing understandably, there's a growing resentment in poorer parts of the world, in developed countries, not just among the men in the street, but even in government. There's a resentment about the developed world not sharing, being too inward-looking in dealing with the crisis, not helping even at this late day, not sort of delivering enough vaccines, not sharing the technology, not sharing the science behind it. Now, this anger, shall we say, this resentment, to what degree does that now complicate diplomatic efforts? To what degree does that complicate counterterrorism efforts? You know, one assumes that if there is that level of unhappiness, then diplomatic efforts are bound to be compromised or at least made much more difficult. And then, of course, if there is that level of dissatisfaction across the world, the resentment against the West in particular is bound to grow, and that also feeds into radicalization, into extremism, which complicates counterterrorism efforts. So let's start with the same. Let's go with the same order. Leila, would you like to go first?
Sure. I just wanted to make a point to what Mark said, and I think on partnerships, because I think what this crisis has shown us very clearly is the new kind of partnerships that we're seeing, government, public, private partnerships, out of necessity. And of course, it's not new, but it's become very apparent. The public partner and the private-public partnerships, how the private sector and the public have reached out to each other to find new ways of partnering. I say this also with a hat in the private sector at the moment,
yes.
Where we see that we need to work hand in hand with the governments in which the company is investing, etc., in the COVID crisis, etc. Now back to your question on what I think is, and a very interesting comment from Gilles on what we haven't seen during the crisis. Now I think the question becomes what might we see down the line, and that's where, you know, what are we seeing in some of our countries, and also some of the success stories, if you like, of COVID-19, where there will inevitably be numbers of unemployed youth, etc., more people who've been online, etc., and in other places in the world, unemployment. And even though we haven't seen the resentment surface yet, I do think that's an issue of prevention work down the line. How do we all, again, maybe in the new partnerships we're seeing, or other partnerships, private, public, create these new jobs, create opportunities for those who have felt disenfranchised. And importantly also, what new forms of activism will we be seeing? And the different constellations of activism, if you like, that will come. And that Gilles alluded to that as well. What we have slightly seen that we might be seeing more of eco-activism, not yet terrorism, but you know there are certain things there which I think is worth keeping an eye on, and the different constellations of activism that are out there.
Nathan?
Yeah, I love this question because it has a little something for everyone. It has strategic competition, it has counterterrorism, it has disinformation. So, I mean, we could spend just an hour on this topic, but let me just cut off a little sliver here. So I guess the entry point that I would start from to get at your question is, prosperous countries are more resilient against various disasters. Prosperous countries, if they experience an earthquake or a hurricane, are going to recover more quickly than developing countries are. And there's a sense in which resilience against a pandemic like COVID is similar, but there's a couple of important differences. One is, the human cost, the human toll of the pandemic is going to be much greater than an earthquake would be. Yeah. And there's also a difference in the sense that the costs borne by and the suffering experienced by developing countries has implications for the prosperous countries as well, because new variants develop in unvaccinated areas and then make it into New York City or Doha. And so in addition to the humanitarian imperative end the suffering, meet the humanitarian need. There's also a self-interested dimension to this as well, where prosperous countries, for their own sakes, need to make sure that we are cutting off virus transmission and mutation for reasons of self-preservation and self-interest. Now, what does that look like in terms of actually operationalizing it? And how does it relate to counterterrorism? Well, I think Africa is one of the areas where these two strands come together in a very important way, because the United States wants to work closely with our African friends, not only on COVID, but also on helping them confront the terrorist challenges they face, whether it's ISIS in Mozambique or Al-Qaeda affiliates in Somalia or in West Africa and the Sahel. And I would just say, in both of those cases, here's what COVID and terrorism have in common. In both of those cases, the United States and our NATO allies and other partners, we have a comparative advantage over any other country in our ability to, one, help defeat COVID because, again, our vaccines are effective, more effective than any others. And two, we have the ability, and it's not just the US, it's our partners and allies as well, to build counterterrorism capabilities that are consistent with the rule of law, that are effective in reducing radicalization to violence, that can protect borders, that can ensure that terrorist criminals get locked up and spend time behind bars. Again, a comparative advantage for the United States and our partners. So back to what President Kagame said earlier today, Africa is important not just because of the role that it could play in competition between the United States and China. It's important in its own right. But I do think that the United States and our partners have very special capabilities on both of these fronts, COVID and counterterrorism, that are really world-class for Africa.
Gilles, what are your thoughts on that question?
You open a very difficult box, which are the drivers of radicalization and to what extent poverty, unemployment lead to violence. I don't believe that much so. It's a mix of many different drivers in which you have to put the ideological dimension, which we sometimes are reluctant to put for political correctness. My answer
forgive me for interrupting, Gilles. There's one other dimension, which is what this question is. It's resentment, right? It's not just poverty and deprivation, but it is a resentment at the sense that you're being dealt a bad hand by people who have undue, unfair advantage. And it's not just yeah, please go ahead.
I'll come to that. To answer your question, and I would go along the line of what both Leila and Nathan said, we probably need to distinguish between the prosperous Western world and the developing world. In Europe, for the time being, and I cross my fingers, we're not faced with an economic crisis. So everything is going rather well. And same in the US, even better in the US. And therefore, that's not the right question for the time being. But as I've said before, if something goes wrong, more people lose their jobs and so on, that may be an impact, that may have an impact, but I'm not very convinced that it's, at least on the AQ-Daesh related forms of terrorism. I'm more worried by the other forms of extremism that I referred to earlier. When it comes to Africa, if you look at for instance, Sahel, even Mozambique, and you try to understand what is going wrong here, it's a lot because the government are not doing well. They are not providing the right and the basic services to the population, not because of the West. If you see the huge amount of money that we are giving them, in the last years, it's above 10 billion euros. And so it's more because of misgovernance, mismanagement, corruption of the elite, and violation of human rights that people may turn to a terrorist extremist group. And it will, the first resentment will be towards their own elite and less towards the West. And I believe that we are evolving in the right direction in the European Union. For the first time, we've decided to link a lot more our assistance to this country to an improvement in the governance and the fight against corruption, which we were not doing before. And in a way, we are more seen as supporting corrupted government, and that may, in a way, feed a bit the resentment. So that's what I would say, my answer to your question.
But if you don't mind expanding on that a little bit,
Yeah.
In Africa, we are seeing democratic retrenchment at a speed that we have not seen in many, many years. The number of countries that have gone from being imperfect democracies, but democracies nonetheless, to having a coup take place and some combination of the military or some sort of a power elite taking power away from democratically elected leaders. I mean, we're seeing that happen. It's a, I don't want to use the term loosely, it's a pandemic of its own in Africa. So how do you, in the middle of this moment, attach accountability to the assistance that you give when you have countries that are going through political turmoil because of coups and takeovers of government at the same time as old, long-standing economic deprivation and the new crisis of the pandemic? I mean, it seems like a perfect storm.
You're right. But if we're not more demanding on human rights and governance, I'm afraid we will just increase the vicious circle that you alluded to. And so I think on our side, people are a bit tired in a way to see this development and not ready to pull more money into countries which are mismanaging so much.
Mark?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, on your first point, we've got clearly this crisis has shown, as I was saying in my first answer, areas where the international system has got to improve. And, you know, we've got a good argument to push forward on that, and particularly around the WHO. I mean, vaccine passports are a great point. You know, just to get to the inequality point, because I know that this is an issue for privileged people who have vaccines, but the fact that it's so hard to set a global standard on something like that without recourse. I mean, we would have wanted to have done that, from a national point of view, but we just looked at the ability to do it through the mechanisms that were available, and you can't. So then you have to sort of basically try and hope private sectors will set the that you will set the standard, and that will kind of create a head of motion, and kind of others will follow on. But if we can sort of look at creating more agile structures that are better inclined to do that, this is going to take time. That's the direction of travel we should go in, and that should address one aspect of what you're talking about, which is because I think you can get through that. You can also get vaccines and manufacturing more quickly, and hopefully we can build more resilience for those sorts of things going forward. But I mean, to flip your point slightly, I mean, something that Nathan said is quite important. You know, the West also has shown through this crisis that its model is best at confronting these challenges still. I mean, we developed the best, most effective vaccines, a range of them that can be deployed in different circumstances. And actually, you know, democracies and innovative societies are the ones that are coming up with most of the most effective means of confronting and tackling the threat. And so what we have to do better, as we're saying when we come to the points that Gilles is making about selling, and that you were saying about African democracy in Africa being on the retreat, is sell the model more effectively and more more confidently than we have been maybe hitherto as well. So I think so basically, to answer your point, I mean, it's not to deny that it's not there, and sure, there's frustration with the lack of access to vaccines and technology, but it's, work on the multilateral angle, strengthen the systems, make them work better for countries that are doing less well, and also, it's strategic competition. So we do have to point out and be unashamed about pointing out where the advantages of the kinds of societies that we think are successful do best.
Thank you, Nathan. I wanted to unpack the point that you made right at the start about China, and sort of maybe ask more generally the impact of this pandemic and the lessons we've learned from that pandemic and how they inform great power competition. You started by making the case that what we've learned from this crisis is that China is not arguably as great a power as it thinks it is, that it has undermined China's credibility in the eyes of the world. I will ask the folks who represent the world to respond to that, but unpack a little more this argument that you are making.
Right, so I think over the past 18 months, there have been two developments that have really sharpened much of the world's skepticism of the good intentions as well as the capabilities of the Chinese Communist Party. They're related. The first is the outbreak of COVID, and the second is Hong Kong. How are they related? Well, in much the same way that there was fear that the rise of COVID would distract policymakers focused on counterterrorism and create opportunities for terrorist groups to act. That didn't happen, as Gilles points out, for the most part. I mean, there are counterfactuals, but for the most part. But I think leaders in Beijing calculated that because the world would be so focused on the pandemic response, that would give them space to take action to suppress democracy and freedom in Hong Kong. And the world wouldn't quite notice as much as it would have had this happened in the ordinary course of business. That turned out to be dramatically incorrect. The world did notice the erosion of freedom and democracy in Hong Kong. Even today, as we speak, there is a university in Hong Kong that is trying to erase historical memory of the Tiananmen Square massacre. The so-called Pillar of Shame, a beautiful sculpture of 50 demonstrators who were slaughtered by the Chinese Communist Party in Tiananmen Square in 1989. At the behest of the CCP, this university is now trying to have this historical monument to this crime erased, purged from memory. But the world is paying attention to this. It would have paid attention in any event, but I think the key point here is that COVID did not slacken the world's appetite for seeing the preservation of democracy and seeing the preservation of human rights and liberty around the world. So I think that factor, China's move into Hong Kong to completely destroy the guarantees that it had made in the joint British-Sino declaration. And I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about this, my friend. That also called into play the trustworthiness of Beijing. If you're going to break your promises to a great power like the UK, maybe you'll make promises in Africa that you can't keep. Maybe you'll be making promises in the South China Sea that aren't worth the paper they are printed on. So in a sort of convoluted way, Beijing overreached with respect to Hong Kong, thinking that the world would be distracted. That turned out not to be the case. And in so doing, I think the Chinese Communist Party only reinforced the concerns about its trustworthiness that it put into play from the very opening rounds of the pandemic with its failures of transparency and visibility.
Gilles, do you trust the Chinese government less now than you did at the start of the pandemic?
Let me qualify a bit before. I'm not representing the EU in this respect. I'm a retired CTC, and I don't want to commit anyone on our side. But yes, I do share to a certain extent what Nathan said on the trustworthiness of China and the lack of transparency during the COVID crisis. Yes, we are wrestling in Europe to try to define a way to, at the same time, ensure that China is a fair competitor in terms of trade, does not bully the world on the cyber side, and abide by the rules. But it's at the same time a major country and a partner when we have to address the big challenges of today's world. Demography in Africa, development of Africa, climate change, and so on. So we need to design a certain response, but yes, a bit less trust than before the COVID crisis, yes.
Mark?
Yeah, I'm more constrained than Gilles
Yes.
in terms of what I can say, but but in terms of a sort of a personal take, at least, on British policy, I think, at the end of the day, we've settled on a policy of telling China and being open about where we think there are problems, and as Nathan said, areas where they are falling below what we would expect in terms of things that they've come to. Someone who spent quite a lot of time when I was growing up in Hong Kong, it's very sad to see the situation there today. And you're right. They have significantly fallen short of the treaty expectations that we had, and we have been very clear about that. And there's not much in hard power terms more than we could do, apart from work with allies and partners, the US in particular, to make clear that we will be unashamed about putting out our own model for engagement, and one which also, of course, protects our close allies and partners in the region collectively, and the joint security of the region. On which basis there are some grounds to be concerned going forward. But I think that also the pandemic showed, just to sort of switch back to the COVID model, while there are lots of questions to answer, of course, around the origin of COVID and the questions around that, and the need for a proper sort of independent investigation around that. There's also the China that we cooperated with over supply chains, who did work cooperatively in many cases with many countries and others to get PPE and other things out as quickly as they could. So I think, and that just reminds us that China is a trading partner, an important part of the world economy, and something that we have to, and a country that we want to not just have to do business with, but want to do business with, and want to have a progressive relationship of trust. So there's lots of decision-making for partners in Beijing. I think that, our point is we will be robust when we need to be, and friendly when we can and want to be.
Bella, what's the view from Oslo?
I don't think I'm in a position to comment on China but I do think, and that's, I suppose, being careful here, is China is a great country and a partner that we need to cooperate with on a number of different issues, whether it's climate, whether it's counter-terrorism, whether it's COVID, etc. But being firm where we have to be, and being cooperative where you must. That's the nature of diplomacy, I suppose, and that's the way forward as well. I think, putting aside the initial stages, I think China also, as Mark alluded to, was cooperative, did share to a certain extent information, etc. That was important in development, etc. If I may just pivot to an issue which was brought up here on what happened behind the scenes during the crisis, and you talked about Hong Kong and the visibility of the protests, demonstrations, etc. Now we know that there were a number of other places where autocratic tendencies, violations of human rights, governance issues were moved under the carpet, where the COVID crisis in a way didn't show the actual extent of things. And I think that's also an issue which needs to be brought up as we move forward. What's happening on the continent, or the African continent, as you mentioned, a number of other countries. And that brings, I think, into the issue, an area of the issue of prevention, which Gilles talked about. I think a key area of prevention on radicalization of counterterrorism is governance. How do you build systems that are strong enough to be resilient for your own population, but not authoritarian? that you have systems that are responsive to the population, that respect human rights and have the rules of law all there that are necessary to deal with counterterrorism. And that, I think, might be an area which will increasingly be put on the forefront as we move forward.
Well, you anticipated my next question, which is, to what extent do you, looking around the world, all of you, are you seeing countries and governments that have authoritarian tendencies take advantage of COVID, as we know they did in the war against terror? There were governments and leaders who took advantage of the world's anxieties to strengthen their own positions, to introduce rules and legislation that gave them an even greater access, greater authority over their people. To what extent are you seeing that? And now that you're a private citizen, Laila, you can name names.
I'm not going to, but I think that's an excellent question. I think it's an issue which we don't really know the extent of yet. I think it's something that should be monitored, will be monitored. I just know from discussions back in Scandinavia, how far can the government go on controlling the population? What does lockdown mean? How far can the government, and that's in the country, a democratic country as Norway. Now, the discussion, I think, is extremely important, also for the most democratic countries. It's a test on our democracy, it's a test on the population, on governance systems that we talked about. Having that open discussion in the public room as a public debate between journalists, between politicians, lawmakers, academics, is an extremely important exercise for a democracy. We know that that's not possible everywhere, that kind of debate in the public arena. And that's also, I think, an important question to bring up and to take the temperature on as we move forward.
Gilles, let me bring you in here.
Bobby,
yes.
I just want to reinforce the point that Laila made. I think we've had, and we still have in Europe, a very healthy debate as to whether COVID has led government to impose measures restrictive of freedoms. And you can accept more control by government, especially if you want to contain the virus, but it has to be limited in time. And as we know that many countries in the world have used the terrorist threat as an argument to restrict freedoms, I think it would be wise to, when all this will be over, probably to assess, make an in-depth studies on the measures which have been taken all over the world in the name of the containment of the COVID crisis to restrict freedoms and try to question them. I've always said in Europe we should have done a lot more, insert a lot more sunset clauses to some of our legislation to address the terrorist threat, like the Patriot Act has to be renewed from time to time, because you can accept restrictive measures for a while if you are faced with a very serious problem, but not forever. So I think it's a very important and valid point.
Nathan?
So big question, I'll just say a couple of things very quickly. So Bobby, your question is about protectual uses of pandemic restrictions in order to increase state control. And that's a worry. Not so much in the West, however. I think in the developed world, we have a different problem. Not deliberate use of COVID as a means of enhancing state authority and preserving the hold-on power of the ruling party. Here, I think the risk is collateral damage, that well-intentioned COVID measures might sweep too broadly than is necessary, might implicate liberties that shouldn't be touched and that aren't necessary to be touched in order to achieve the public health goals, or that might stay in place too long. This is Gilles' point about sunsets. And so the experience of the United States during the early years, thankfully not years, early days of the pandemic, left some people scratching their heads about why policymakers drew the lines where they did. So, for instance, casinos remain open or state-run liquor stores remain open, but houses of worship are capped at 25 people or a very small percentage of the seating capacity. Is buying Jack Daniels really more important than going to church or mosque or synagogue? Is intoxication a more fundamental liberty than freedom of worship? And so I think policymakers need to be mindful of the need for very precisely tailoring of public health restrictions when it comes to things that are as fundamental as freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of worship, and various other core liberties.
Mark?
You know, it's funny, there was a great debate in the UK, for those that followed, about Scotch eggs and whether they are a substantial meal.
I remember.
And it just proves how absurd, though, that debate can get about the sort of sense of restrictions versus, versus things. I wanted to zoom out on this question slightly. You know, I think one of the points you're making about states taking advantage of this, you know, I think we have seen examples of that. I think the strategic point for us in global security going forward, though, is we need to get used to the idea in an era of greater competition, especially those of us in the Euro-Atlantic security zone, that revisionist powers are going to do that more often, that we're going to have more disruptive events in the next 10 to 20 years than we are used to, that terrorism, as bad as and as dangerous and as big as a challenge as it was, probably is not sort of going to be the defining sort of challenge of our lifetime, and it was. We're going to have conflict over water, climate. You know, we all know the themes, and I think that our public and our policy-making circles, particularly as I say in the Euro-Atlantic sphere, are not yet geared up and not yet sharp enough to sort of respond to and react to revisionist powers using those opportunities to advance their agenda. So you could say that Hong Kong is one of those because, you know, it's a great global city, it's a place of, you know, great innovation. And at the time that they took those measures, it was locked down and closed. And so it was harder for people to make the argument that, you know, Hong Kong became, you know, as fantastic and as innovative and as brilliant place as it was because of its freedoms and because of its unique role in the region and the world because of the lockdown. And that's what I mean. You know, yes, we can sort of obsess about that specific thing, but it's demonstrative of the opportunities that some of these disruptive factors create for powers seeking to make a revision. But we've another advantage, though, that we need to remember is that a lot of states are really, as we sort of touched on earlier, under, I think, a lot of scrutiny and pressure for the way in which they've handled COVID crisis, and it hits vulnerable. Those states which sort of are some of those revisionist powers are quite vulnerable to it. You know, Iran has had quite a bad COVID crisis, for example, and I mean, we don't have lots of opinion polls and things coming out of there to judge this by, but I think it's a safe conclusion that it has really damaged the credibility and put a lot of pressure on the regime there.
The low turnout in the election would be very indicative.
Exactly. It's a good indicator, yeah.
Okay, we're coming towards the end of this discussion, so I will ask, I'll go back to where I started, when I said that this COVID crisis, once we realized that it was a global crisis, this in some ways became a test of multilateralism, of the multilateral institutions that have been functioning with various levels of efficiency for the last 7 or 8 decades since the end of the Second World War. I would like each of you to, if you don't mind, on a scale of 1 to 10, give a mark for how you feel multilateralism as a concept, and if you like, you can zoom down to individual institutions, but how has multilateralism performed in dealing with this crisis? And I'll start with you, Gilles, as a person who worked in the multilateral institution for a very long time in the EU. How do you feel, not necessarily the EU itself, how do you feel the concept of multilateralism has held up in the past 2 years? And what is the grade?
You're right. You're right. Multilateralism is really in the DNA of the European Union. When it comes to the European Union, I would give it a quite good note. I would say around 8 to 9, because if we have been a bit slow at the outset, I think the policy which has been led by the European Commission has been very impressive. So 8 to 9. For the world, much less. And I would put something like 4 or 5.
Nathan?
That's tough. I guess, I mean, I would go back to something that I said during my opening remarks and sort of quibble a bit with the premise of the question, which is to say that multilateralism is the best way to handle the response to the pandemic. I think multilateral institutions certainly have a very important role to play, the WHO being the leading example of this. But I would not accept a framing of this question in which that is the lens through which we understand the response to the pandemic. Because I think bilateral country-to-country assistance or programs is also important. And such as the United States unilaterally providing vaccines to Haiti, for instance. And I also think—
Should it have had to do that, though? So aren't the multilateral institutions there to do that? The fact that the United States had to help Haiti out, is that, is that a failure of multilateralism?
I don't think it's a failure of the WHO as much as it is that the United States has an important bilateral relationship with a neighbor and would prefer to handle that relationship one-on-one. Now, the United States is also providing vaccine through COVAX, and I would point out we're giving it to COVAX. We're not selling it, unlike other countries. And again, our vaccine actually works. The one that's being sold to COVAX, somewhat less effective. But to your point, I think the WHO, as the principal multilateral body here, was put through a stress test. And it succeeded in a number of ways. But some of its shortcomings also reflect the difficulties that a multilateral body like the WHO finds itself in when under pressure from, on the one hand, the United States and its Western partners that have certain expectations for how it will perform and the levels of transparency and accountability. I'm thinking now of the investigation that the WHO did into the origins of the virus in Wuhan, while at the same time being under enormous strain from the Chinese Communist Party. And I think the inconclusive and terribly unsatisfactory report that the WHO issued about the origins of the virus, not finding anything conclusive, suggests that it's a very dramatic illustration of how multilateralism cannot succeed. There are circumstances where multilateral organizations are not set up to succeed, but are set up to fail when great power competition comes to the fore.
Would you care to give it a grade?
Well, I don't know. I'm in a generous mood today, so I'll give it a C.
No, out of 10.
Oh, I'm in a generous mood, so I'll give it a 5.
Okay.
Wow.
Mark?
I'll give it a 6. Multilateralism is based out of its institutions, its forums, and its norms, right? I think the norms, by and large, have been respected, with some quibbling about the early stages you were talking about. I don't think the institutions have performed as well as we'd hoped. But the other thing that, for someone who spent years on the UN Security Council, the other thing that we forget about multilateral institutions is that they provide a forum for dialogue and discussion. And I think that we've made it through an extraordinary pandemic, which none of us, there's no anticipation, all the things we know, the superlatives around there, without any conflict or open aggression. And I think in previous sort of centuries and generations, when we're talking about, we could have seen a race to conflict over this. And so I just always say that with multilateral institutions, it's important to remember that they're relatively new in kind of international affairs, and just because they aren't as shiny and as effective as we'd like to see them, they're playing an important role in kind of providing forums and dialogues. And then I think we've also seen some bright points, albeit in smaller groupings. But the G7, we chaired a very productive G7 meeting which dealt with aspects of COVID, I think, and COVAX as a mechanism was stood up, as I said earlier, really quickly, and some countries, ours as well, have donated large amounts to that. So we can do more, we can strengthen those efforts, but I don't think they failed. So I think you have to be above 5, and I think there are a couple of sort of bright points that maybe build you up to 6?
So 6 out of 10 from you. Laila, the last word?
I'll be more generous. I think, yeah, and that's maybe just as a believer in multilateralism, I do see we have seen multilateralism stand up to its challenge. It took it some time. I would give it a 7 to that, the different forms of multilateralism, if you like. Now, where we failed, I think, and where we should have been better is in its preparation. You know, we all say we should have prepared, we knew, we've talked about, if not COVID, a certain pandemic coming, inevitably. Where we prepared, I think that's a real failure for multilateralism, not seeing it happening or as quickly or as encompassing, you know, that it really touched on every single, every one of us and every part of our society. I think that is where we failed as countries, but also in the multilateral setting.
So 7, you said.
On the response,
right.
But on preparation, what would you say? What's a failure?
Well, but it's.
I mean, certain mechanisms were there. There were preparations, but you know, we were not quick enough when it came to seeing the warning signals.
Well, hopefully we've learned some lessons from this crisis. It would be a shame to waste it. Mark, Laila, Nathan, and Gilles, thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your very valuable opinions. Ladies and gentlemen, your panel.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.